Okay, now we're entering part two on this, Genesis Relooked. But I have to apologize due to an editing error there. And then after realizing that I had left something out, I just cut it back to the point where mankind's being created again, which was where we were at. And of course, it's plural, like we talked about. But it goes beyond that quite a bit. And as you go through the first part of the story here, through chapter 2 and 3, it goes into depth quite a bit. So it even tells you twice that it's done in our likeness, in our own image, to have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing on the earth. So God created man in his own image, so an image of the gods. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So there's a first creation before Adam even steps up to the plate. And then God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it, have sex, fill the earth, subdue it, which sounds like to take it over and everything, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over every living thing that moveth on the earth. So in this idea here, we're just meant to take over and go ape shit, I guess. We're not given the correct, rule book that he comes up with here later. And then he pulls a trick on everybody. But so he says, see, I have given you every herb that yields seed, which is also on the face of the earth, every tree. It shall be for food and our consummation. Also to every beast of the earth, to every air. And so also you're supposed to eat the beasts and everything, but everybody says no. There was a period in between all the fruit and things, so you're supposed to be vegan in some way. And of course we look back at archaeology and there's no way that we're vegan, but it seems like we took a giant step. When are we not? We're vegan, definitely. And that gave us more and more, and it kept going from there. It's just consolidated protein, and now in modern days we have that so figured out, that it's amazing. I made the kind of statement before that we eat better than kings ever did now, just your common person does. And then if you're really affluent, you're eating way better than any king did. And of course you're getting choices from around the world and so on too, which is just quite extravagant. Let's continue. So he gave, and he says it again, to everything that creeps on the earth in which there's life. So he's trying to describe that you have dominion and you can eat everything, right? And that it's just all hunky-dory. And this idea of having life that they give right there is actually the word for soul. Then again, if you look at the word for their version of hell, you see we talk about hell all the time, and we use it as the expression. No one says Sheol, and that's what their hell is. Or actually, it's named two different things in Gehenna too. But anyhow, in this flat Earth model, it's we're sitting on the Earth. Then there's this magical bubble that's above us, and air and breath of life situation. Because if you choke you or you go underwater, you drown. So it's this magical place, and if you went high enough on mountains, getting even close to space, like Himalayas and stuff, you run out of air, gets too thin, so it must get thinner and thinner and then choke you out there. But somehow they had the idea that was water up there. But then again, I talked about how the firmament could, back in the Sumerian stories, if you look into the different places that they have it listed in there, it comes across as being an idea of ice and stuff, because it's found up on mountains in certain places and way to the north and in winter and things of like that nature. And so what we're talking about is this strange, weird thing that looks like a cloud, can make rain, rains water, makes all the rivers, but then those can freeze up into something that's solid. It's magic, you see. It's transmutation of things. Yeah, it's amazing. We learn how to do it, and we learn how to boil water and turn it into steam, and then you can if you have some water and you take it to a real cold area, you can get it to actually freeze up. But that's magic, and we did the same type thing with bricks. For if you make a good clay slurry and you do it just right, block it up and then let it dry, then all of a sudden it becomes almost as hard as stone, and then you fire it like the forge of God, and next thing you know, it's a hardened brick. I was talking to somebody about it the other day, and they were blown away on the fact that, yeah, modern day bricks is about the best thing going. Our houses are still built out of them, and it's like, that looks like one of the earliest building materials. You know, before that we had dolmens and all kinds of things, and even Göbekli Tepe, which is like stone, so I guess it's kind of Fred Flintstone-ish. But in the same breath, we actually used to build out of straw and thatch and worked our way up through the Three Little Pigs just like they do. Isn't that kind of amazing? So indeed, he says it was every good, and that's the evening or morning of the sixth day, and you see that tabulates to how many different tablets there were in the Sumerian story. They wrote down the Sumerian story thousands and thousands of times. This is something that the kids going through school would have to do, and you had to space your words just like we do today whenever you get the little big rule tablet and big chief tablet and the number 2 pencil, and you have to write between the lines, and you can have the same amount, and everybody can have the same amount on their paper. Well, if you write smaller or bigger, you're going to have more or less. But they tried to quell that too, and every line is supposed to be spaced out to where it fits, and so it only fit on 6 tablets. Well, it goes to a 7th, but God rests in that Sumerian story also, and here we have a God that's not omni-strength and all of that in a bag of chips, because after going through all this magic, it's like Mickey Mouse and Fantasia or Gandalf or whatever, and you see in these magicians of old and all these Dungeons and Dragons type of movies that whenever they use this power, it makes them weak and stuff a little bit, and takes some life force to make it happen and all these things. And of course you've seen magicians try to pull off this idea where it hurts and does things like that to them to pull things off, and after they do it a couple of times, I can't do it anymore, you know, it just takes too much out of me, woo, all that type of stuff. But so this all happened from in between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In fact, they tell you clearly where it's all at and where this happened at, because this was a Sumerian story. And the headwaters that led to that are the rivers that ran through Eden. And if you see, all this was lost, all this Sumerian story was lost for thousands of years, and I guess the people that were into it and had destroyed Babylon over a few times kind of thought that no one's ever going to figure out any of that stuff that's all gone. Well, amazingly, that brick tablet, whenever they knocked everything down and burned it all, it fired those things into bricks, and then they got crushed up under, and another floor built onto them, and another civilization built on top of that, and it just became the foundation. And once we dug down through that, we're like, hey, here's the Library of Ashurbanipal. And just like whenever they figured out how the cuneiform writing in the Egyptians worked, these people invented cuneiform writing. And they have these stories too. And a lot of them connect to Egyptian tales too, so you can see that there's a commonality that goes between all of these people that I've talked about before in a different way. But let me see if we can just get through this part a little bit better. So in Genesis 2, this is the Garden of Eden. And thus the heavens and the earth and the host of them were finished. So, you know, God did this super thing, it's magic again. And on the 7th day, God ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had done. See how it says that twice? Then God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because he rested from all of his work and God had created and made. You see how they doubled up and then they doubled it up again there? That's another Sumerian thing where they keep reiterating something, you know, sort of like, and just say it slightly different. Yeah. This is a history of the heavens and the earth, and when they were created, in the day the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, before any plant or field was on the earth, before any earth or field had grown, before the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the earth, and there was no man to till the ground, but a mist went up to the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. Now, So here's an idea that like some comet hit us or something, and something happened and everything rained for a long time. We can find that in the Younger Dryas event that I've talked about quite a few times, but that's the only thing that really connects it to it. Sure, there's been storms that come through, and we even know that there was a tsunami that came from off of India, and the oceans off of there from a way earlier meteorite that hit in the water actually and caused a huge thing that you can see chevrons on the earth. It looks like where the sand washes away on a beach, only they're huge, just like you can find the same thing in the Americas around the Younger Dryas event. But let's not go off too far on this. And so he caused it to rain upon the whole face of the earth, so he planted everything, and then they got to water it. And this is just like the same way of gardening. And also before this, he's talking about the herbs of the field before they had grown, and before this, before that. So he's trying to do a preemptive type situation. And then all of a sudden in 7, he says here, the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. This is actually a golem spell. If you've ever played Dungeons and Dragons, you end up having to make a golem. If you've got anybody that's got any creativity, like whenever we were playing and I was dungeon mastering and stuff, you have to have some kind of spell, and you have to kind of know what's going on to do it. You might even have something that you have to say to invoke it to make this thing come to life, because you're fixing to have a suit of armor that's animated, or something that's like in Labyrinth, where that door forms two halves, forms the whole thing, and then it comes after him and starts clanging and banging around. It can be all kinds of things. In classic D&D, it actually is a man made of mud that turns hard like stone, and so you're hitting something that actually is pretty tough, like he's wearing armor. It's not just the simplest thing in the world whenever you have to take it on too, but that's a golem spell. I've made a whole video about this idea of golems and stuff, so you can make the connection that here's 3 or 4 magic tricks that there's 6 days worth of magic tricks that went off here, and apparently each one is a separate spell to make things happen, by the way. Not one just poof, not some big bang that eventually forms something, but he has to pull everything off, and he kind of got to rest every night. And that leads to the Dungeons and Dragons idea, where you can only use a spell per day and you have to wait till you've rested. Of course, an easy way around that is, as long as you're not having an encounter, you can have everybody form a camp, and then you relearn the spell. The idea is that you learn it off a scroll, and then it's imbibed into you, but somehow you forget it. You can't really do things at will, and not too many spells. And once we get into advanced Dungeons and Dragons and stuff, you could use some spells like that, but other ones you had to use, and it was a daily situation. And you get to specialize, and you usually got to use that more than once, and also it does a little more extra damage, and of course that becomes your one of choice usually. But anyhow, past the golem spell that's formed here, where a man is formed out of the dust of ground and turned into a little clay model here, by the way, again. And what's not mentioned in here that used to be mentioned into it, apparently, that a lot of scholars have said, was that it took God's spit, and some of them say semen and stuff like that, which you can lead that into the idea of the Egyptians talking about how this happened with creation. In fact, the Milky Way in some ways is looked as being a big ejaculation of life. In fact, the whole universe is droplets just flying around and creating life. And to think that we're the center of everything, whenever what we realize now, compared to what this book says that we're supposed to be. People were killed whenever they said, the sun's the center of everything and we go around it, and God made it that way and it's cool, and they just choked that dude to death. Or did a whole lot of torturing to make him say that he didn't believe the thing that he knew was true. I mean, he just checked it all out with a mouth, and he goes, we're spinning like a ball, so that's the reason it looks like that. There's a Sumerian tale from thousands of years before that, where somebody is apparently holding up a light to a campfire, and in one series of knowledge that gets being taken down by Enki and so on, they end up saying something to the effect of, with that ball and the sun is on this side of the planet, and whenever it's on the other side of the planet, which is after sunset, and it goes down, which is akin to Seth, by the way, and Seth of the Egyptians, by the way, and connectives here. But that's the dark side and the right side of, Earth as the day is spinning around. And then another place it says that the stars are like our sun, but in the distance, but as a torch in the distance, far, far away. Now that's something we can understand even today with science and the knowledge that we have. The weird thing that was the difference are the planets that moved around, and they're attached to us and doing things, and they were akin to gods from way back. Once people figured it all out, and the shamans could say things and show them and point them out to people sometimes. People that didn't know all of this, though, would lose them, whereas the astronomer people were seeing them every day. So here we have the Garden of Eden, and they say it parted in 4 river heads where this garden is, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? It's there. So they kind of, by the way, just say that there's only one tree there, and then there's 2, and then there's just really that one tree that's real important. Don't eat from it. And then, of course, later God says that, wow, I'm glad they didn't eat from the tree of life, because if they did, they would be immortal. Crazy thing about this is no matter which way you go through it in apologetics and try to figure it all out, is that Adam and Eve were supposed to have been somewhat immortal, but that's the reason we aren't immortal. This is a tale of Gilgamesh and so on. In fact, the flaming sword after they get kicked out of the Garden of Eden, I'll be darned. Swords were created much later than everything, but Gilgamesh had a flaming sword. Yeah, it's where we get it from in D&D, where somebody will have an ice sword. Well, it does extra frost damage, unless you're fighting something that's cold-natured, probably, and so on. You have limitations. And it's like orc swords and so on, and as far as the elves go and Lord of the Rings, it's kind of like, you would say, if they have a plus during certain creatures, they probably have a negative versus something, whether you know it or not. And if you don't know, I'm probably going to throw it at you here in a minute and you'll figure it out. But anyhow, so God creates everything, and he's supposed to be all of that in a bag of chips. And they describe the 4 rivers that run through here, and they figured out the Hiddekel and the Euphrates are the Tigris and Euphrates. But then the other 2 is one that's skirts the whole land of Havilah, which is supposed to be coming out and running down, which is kind of dried up nowadays and isn't a constant river. And funny that they mention in this where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. So they're already all about gold here, just at the very start of everything. Isn't that funny? And Bdellium and the onyx stone are there. The name of the second river is Gihon, which is one that goes around the whole land of Cush. So see, this is just way later, but then you can always apologetic your way out of it and say, well, they're saying it apparently to where the words are now, and people have said, one of those comes from the way, way, way back machine, and the other one is really not the current river of it, but a conflagration of another people's culture that apparently their verbiage came out much later, and you're trying to twist that into a Hebrew type word. So it's a loan word, as people would call it. Then the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to tend and keep it. So apparently all this stuff happens right back to back, of course, right? I mean, he doesn't let him hang around for 1,000 years. But back to that immortality. He lived over 900 years, supposedly. Nowadays, we'd probably look at that as being foolish somewhat. But, that we would call that immortal. In fact, you talk about Dungeons and Dragons, that's where the elf concept of long lives and everything comes from. And deep studies would show you that they went off a lunar calendar in ancient times, and because there's 13 moons, if you take and divide the number by 13 that they're giving you, you'll come up with a more rational number. Like Methuselah lives like 79 years or something. But of course, people had kids and got married and so on younger back then. Wouldn't take a 15-year-old, so he got to see his great-great-grandkids. Well, that's what it says. And Lamech didn't die till right before Noah did the thing and all the stuff too. You look at those people overlap. Noah was still alive 6 years before Abraham took his trip, if you figure out all this and stuff. And so they backtracked that and said, well, here comes the great flood. Well, they're not off more than 70 years from a flood sedimentation that Woolley found a long time ago and tried to say that it might be something from the Bible or where their story of the flood comes from, because there's a huge flood that happens up there, and of course it floods up to a certain point, and we only find that in one layer here, and dating to all the stuff that's trapped into it and trash and rubbish in that layer, we're able to pull off something that's, you know, over 2200 BC. You know, that dates to the Sumerian till, not even the flood of the Bible. But they're not off by too far. It was a kind of guess a little bit, and somebody wants to write some new tale, and it's going to have differences in it. And you're not supposed to, whenever these initiates write these things, you're not supposed to just sit there and word for word, you know, like you used to do in school, write out of Collier's encyclopedias or whatever. You're supposed to do it different. And once I figured that out, I'd just read through it, and he would tell me something, and then I would write down my own version of it, my own verbiage. It's amazing how good of a grade you get. So you just learn about something and then you regurgitate it back out. Like you're supposed to read this and go in there and they're going to ask you a couple of questions and you're supposed to tell them all about it. So here's the weird thing, and the Lord God caused, Adam got to name each creature, every single one. Somebody, of course, they try to give this apologetics for this kinds of creatures and so on like that. So if they can fit on some kind of boat that was that size, because just a common zoo won't fit on an aircraft carrier, which you can put few arcs on an aircraft carrier. So no, it's not going to work. Oh, well, they say it's just these kinds or whatever. No. Archaeological record says there were all these things going on. There is some things that left 10,000 years ago at the Younger Dryas event. That was our last of the, you know, creatures that aren't here anymore, kind of a dinosaur situation. In fact, the only weird freaks are left in a few parts of India. There were some mammoths that stayed over in an island area of Siberia, but in Africa you can still find that too, because there hasn't been mass predation. And as the Sahara does its thing, people really seem to drift away from that area. If you'll want to go with the out of Africa theory on that concept, you can, but of course a lot of people now said it may be in and out of Africa and a back to and all kinds of stuff, so it is not one way straightforward, and there wasn't just one people and part of them went out, but huge differences of people from still extant hominids that were still living on to at least 4400 BC in certain areas to actually 315,000 years ago. A modern human Homo sapiens was there, and apparently he went back out and back in again too. So there's a crazy overlap there. It doesn't go like, well, these turned into these. No. Got other videos about that too, and it shows something about it. But so here's the weird one right here. After God makes a mistake here, he builds all the creatures and everything, and there was not found a helper comparable to Adam. So this is supposed to, like, what, was he trying to mate with other creatures and everything, and there just wasn't anything around, and the unicorn wasn't putting out, or what's going on here? Well, God created 2 by 2 by 2, but he whoopsie. So we've got to throw in this idea, and I did a recent video about how a rib and Ninti, and means lady of the rib, and how this in the Inky story is creating someone out of a rib, and an idea. People look at a modern day and say, well, that's something you can get genetics out of real good and so on, and it's a way to double explain that, and the fact that men have less one rib and so on. They gave one up for her and so on. But he put a deep sleep on him. Here's magic. Just like they put a deep sleep on you, and then they levitate you up, and then they levitate you down and stand you back up, and then take you out of your deep sleep, that hypnotic shit, magic trip. took one of her ribs and closed up the flesh in its place, and the rib which the Lord God had taken man, he made into a woman, and he brought her to the man. Oh, just bingo pow. Poof, alakazam, abracadabra. You know, some of the earliest depictions of Jesus Christ show him with a magic wand. I'm serious. Thought about making a video about that, like Jesus magic. Might still do it, because there's quite a few things that are in there, from spitting in the mud and rubbing somebody's eye and all of a sudden they can see again. You know, Jesus got a lot of things conflagrated in with him. But one of the things that you see just all around, all over the place, in fact in India and every place that the Aryans went, spread this idea and concepts that ended up being different, and conflagrations of their own stuff from around that, and putting it all together. And in most situations they were like, we kicked their ass. Who? Us. And so they conflagrate themselves into us and say that they kicked off somebody else that was supposed to be invading, and it was actually them themselves. It's the way a lot of the folklore went, not always, but even in India you can find this god where somebody tells them that they're blind and they would like to be able to look upon you, O Lord, but I'm blind. And out of the grace of his goodness, he made him sight and be able to see, and then all of a sudden he can see again, and then he cuts off his sight again, just like peekaboo, just showing you his power again, of course, and like, you know, a shuffle trick, and here it is and there it's not. But also there have been people that connected that to the idea that sun worship and people staring into the sun and trying to get used to it so they could see the sun better and recognize sunspots and these things would actually drive themselves to blindness. And you're always told not to look into the sun. It'll burn your retina. It's so bright. It's like looking at welding. You think, oh, it's just real sparky. I kind of squint and I do that and everything, and then you'll have this big old glare in your eyes that you can see out on the edges, but not where that glare was looking at. You don't ever do that with welding. It's like a little piece of the sun. You're just sitting there staring at it, and you're doing a whole bunch of sparks. I don't know if you've ever lit a lighter in front of you, but if you're doing it like in the dark and your eyes have adjusted after you do that flick, and then you go back to dark again, you can see that exact flick and where the sparks went and everything there for a period of seconds, and then it slowly goes away. Anyhow, I'm rambling on, but I think all of it's somewhat valuable. But here's the part where God takes a woman. A woman grows from a rib, and then later here we're going to talk about she eats from a magic tree again. So here's magic trees, which is the tale of Inanna and the Halupa tree, which had a snake in it and so on, that's thrown in here and twisted around. But strangely enough, after the talking snake told her to eat from the magic tree, she did, and that's the reason we're all in sin and all this stuff. And it doesn't make much sense, does it? People say, well, it's supposed to be an apple, but then archaeology says there's no apples in that area, so and all of a sudden they have to freak out on it, and they go, well, the original story here was a pomegranate tree, and in one of Inanna's tales it's a pine cone, pine nuts, which pine cones also have to do with a sacred geometry, and so do pomegranates and so on. But pomegranates are quite red, and they have seeds in them and such, and it really looks like a type of rebirth, or you're eating the seeds of things. Of course, every nut off every tree is a seed that makes a new tree, and all of that type of thing. Just like when we eat eggs. You know, somebody said a long time ago, the comedian Stephen Wright, you know I'm talking about, he actually said, I've taken it up to like eating fried chicken embryos. And everybody goes, and he goes, eggs. And then they all laugh. But then they kind of go, anyhow, I like eggs, and it's sure a part of a lot of foods that you don't know until you have some friend that has egg allergies, and all of a sudden you're like, wow. Anyhow, so Adam says, now this is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she came out of man. Well, that woe part doesn't happen till later. But see, Eve isn't even called Eve until after she screws up everything and so on, and she's the mother of all. And that name Hueva, it actually in Latin comes out to being an egg. So here we go again. But actually in the Hebrew, it's just one vowel off from being whore or prostitute. Well, the mother of all, you can see how that can be conflagrated. Well, back then, there were sacred prostitutes at temples and so on, and it's a totally different thing in the way to look at. And they would say, well, she's the mother of all of this stuff. Probably, and a lot of people have looked at it and say, well, this actually goes back to a time where there was this lady shaman that was great, and she had all these different kids that were priests, and they try to relate it to the time, and that's how the priests of the temple are, because they come from certain families and so on, right? Anyhow, so she grew from a rib, and therefore a man shall leave his father and mother to be joined to his wife, and they shall become as one flesh. And they were both naked, and the man and his wife were not ashamed. For they're not ashamed of being naked. You see, at this time, people are already, of course, clothed, and they said, well, it's kind of nasty to go naked and doing so on. But you can look at the Greek statues, and if they were a mother, you can see one tit hanging out. Modern day, we would think that was a symbol of breastfeeding or something like that, and it really did have something seemingly to do with that type of concept. But most women didn't run around with a tit hanging out. It's it's a different thing that's done in art and so on, and showing you purity and situation and everything. And